Hey, good morning, and welcome to the UroPatient podcast. I'm your host, Vic Sinise. We meet every Saturday at 10:30 a.m. Central Time. And if you're watching us live, we're on YouTube and Facebook Live every week. And you can always watch our on demand by going to our UroPatient.com website, where you'll find all of our past episodes. Also, the best place to go to get any of our handouts, we've got a bunch of them. So go and check those out. Every program I put out, I have a handout with valuable information for you guys. And this week, we're glad to have Dr. Wayne Quang joining us. And he's going to be talking about a great subject, defending the detrusor.
So with that, let's talk a little bit about that engine within us, the bladder, that pump, and how do we begin to optimize it. And so my objective today is to share with you our collective effort to optimize peak performance, to be effective doing the right thing, to be efficient doing things right. And my promise to you is that together as defenders of the detrusor with our cystoscopic swords and our pressure flow shields, that we can accelerate the change away from a drug-first approach to a bladder-centric paradigm for BPH care. And by so doing, we have to first prioritize the preservation of bladder health. And by so doing, we can put an end to the polypharmacy epidemic when we accept the fact that medications are simply a temporizing measure, and we can prevent late-stage BPH. Back in the 1980s, we had very limited treatment options, whether it was simple prostatectomy, TURP, but at that time, medications, drugs, held the position at the front of the line. They were first-line therapy. And now, over time, we've developed guidelines. The AUA guidelines currently tell us and submit that to be effective is to manage symptoms. To be efficient is to follow the protocol that defaults men to standard treatment that starts with a trial of medical therapy, after which, and only after then, do we then consider surgical therapy. What makes urology great and this whole village, this whole tribe of defenders of the detrusor is that we apply systems thinking. We like to use the levers of Archimedes, right, to move the world of BPH. And today, let's grab a hold of the first level at the very high level of level 3. Let's look at our goals. And those goals, we've reframed them as the elements of efficiency. When we look at the BPH care pathway, this BPH system, we want to be looking at the durability of treatments with a favorable benefit to risk profile. We want to look at economic sustainability, right? As defender Dr. Kaplan says, the science of money has to make sense. And then we want to respect, honor, and hold close to us a man's vitality. How do we restore it? How do we optimize it? How do we make sure that a man has his physical health, emotional health, intellectual, spiritual, sexual, professional, and financial health? And finally, which we will talk more about, is the window of curability. This element is really important in the pre-treatment phase when we look at the decision-making process for how do we determine the proper timing of deobstruction to maximize the preservation of detrusor function or bladder health. Urology has now gifted all of us with this tremendous treatment landscape for BPH. We now have a comprehensive set of surgical tools in our tool belt, ranging from the most invasive, like robotic prostatectomy, the invasive surgical therapies like electric surgical, lasers, enucleation, aquablation, as well as minimally invasive surgical therapies like UroLift and Resume, as well as least invasive surgical therapies like now iTind, and the new player on the block is now Optilume. On this treatment landscape, though, the very first position continues to be occupied by BPH medications. And it starts with us first recognizing that the bladder has been neglected. We need to restore it on top of the pedestal where it belongs. It is too precious. It is so amazingly complex. There are only two major organs that cannot be transplanted: the brain and the bladder. And we need to stop pushing it to the side. We need to let it come back onto the red carpet and share the limelight with the prostate. And for far too long, we've been watching bladders die or in the process of dying. And now we can see it here. There's a fantastic paper from 2020 from defenders Kaplan, Kohler, and Kausick, the 50,000 non-invasive pressure flow study. Disclosure, I did contribute my data to this data set. And we see, and we have all suspected, as men age, as that prostate donut hole begins to tighten, we see the flows diminish and reflexively, and the bladder will now begin to increase its compensatory pressures. It has to work harder, it has to squeeze harder, and it squeezes harder and harder until it reaches a peak around the age of 62, after which the bladder begins to decompensate. And so we need to return back to first principles to address this of inefficiency in the pre-treatment phase. We need to ask ourselves, is what we thought to be true really true? Is it true that to be effective is to manage symptoms? Is it true to be efficient is to default men to start with a trial of medical therapy? Much work needs to be done in this area. Let us accept that drugs are not a mechanical solution. They are a temporizing measure. And for right now, with our newer pathway, despite having a full complement of technologies, we still have positioned medications at the very front of the line for therapies. We have given them the title of first-line therapy, and that's not right. We need to understand that drugs delay deobstruction. And so we would ask that it's time to rewrite the treatment landscape, and we need to reassign and relegate medications to their proper category, which is really temporizing measures alongside catheters and temporary stents and lifestyle changes and modifiable factors, and recognize they are temporizing measures that buy us time in the pre-treatment phase to accurately and precisely assess the mechanical problem. We will spend a little time on this slide, and I wish the listeners could see it. This is the face of bladder death and dysfunction. At the top left, there is a beautiful, healthy bladder. It's as smooth as a baby's bottom. It's pink, full of hope, and smooth and inviting, and has so much to its future. And then somewhere along the lines, we allow that bladder to fall victim to the villainous constricting evils of the prostate, and allow for trabeculation, those hard ridges running through the bladder like railroads, and then to the point where it's permanently damaged, and we see the pocketing, the cellules, the diverticuli. And it starts with better education. For all patients, we need to be efficient by providing bladder health counseling for all patients early on and upfront. We need to recognize and reinforce that there is only one bladder. It is so amazing, it is not even transplantable. So, Mr. Smith, we need to take care of that. We need to respect that every man has a choice, but they need to understand that every choice has a consequence. They need to know what they should be bothered by. When we look up that word, it is that which we are disturbed about, upset about, worried about. They need to know this, and we need to research these types of pre-treatment concerns. They need to know what's at stake if the choice is made to not take definitive action to deobstruct their prostates. And the timing of obstruction is critical to save their bladders. That decision-making process in the pre-treatment phase is critical. And it starts with predicated on two things. One is that the prostate is a organ that's about the size of a golf ball, but in the shape of a mini donut. And Mr. Smith, your heart is a muscle that pumps blood. Your bladder is a muscle that pumps urine through the prostate. And for that reason, Mr. Smith, there's 5 stages to your bladder health. The first stage is as you get older, that prostate gets bigger and the donut hole grows smaller. And as a result, things will slow down. In stage 2, Mr. Smith, if we don't take care of it, that bladder begins to struggle. It has to work harder and harder to squeeze urine through that tightening donut hole. And as a result, it becomes like an overactive bladder with urgency, frequency, and getting up in the middle of the night as it begins to quiver. And then stage 3, the bladder will then become like a rebellious child. It will act out without your permission, squeeze without your permission, and cause you to leak on yourself. And stage 4, just like the heart can have a heart attack, the bladder can all of a sudden stop working, and you show up in the emergency room because your bladder has 2 to 4 liters in there, and you now need a catheter. And finally, heaven forbid, Mr. Smith, we do not want you to enter into stage 5, heart failure, Just like the heart can go into heart failure, the bladder can go into bladder failure, where you may need a catheter for the rest of your life. And Mr. Smith, you and I are working here together because most men, as we all know, are actually coming to us often in stage 2. And our goal today is to work together to prevent patients from entering stage 3, 4, and 5. And this is all outlined in the book, 5 Stages of Bladder Health.
And it was really great, Dr. Quang. I really enjoyed that presentation. For you guys out there, remember, you only have one bladder, so don't blow it. Make sure you get checked. Be sure you're doing something as you start to notice some of these symptoms popping up, the bladder is making you get up at night more often. Things are slowing down. Get checked, because if you wait too long, sometimes it can be too long. And if the bladder stops working, there's no way to replace it. You're going to be stuck with a catheter, either wearing a catheter all the time or learning how to catheterize yourself. So, word of warning, get it checked. We'll see you all next week.